do at the Abolition School, and how this seminar series is going to function. So the Du Bois Movement School, or Abolition School, as it's colloquially known in Philadelphia, is a Philadelphia-based education program that seeks to prepare a new generation of organic intellectuals for the struggles looming on the horizon. Now entering its fourth semester, the Abolition School family now includes over 200 organizers across the city who are dedicated to revolutionary abolition and the unfinished project of Reconstruction. We operate according to 4 basic principles. We are abolitionists, first and foremost. We understand that every abolition must also be a reconstruction, meaning that we can't just tear down carceral systems without building up alternatives. We are also internationalists because we know that the oppressive structures we confront are global, and so too must be our resistance to them. We do intersectional analysis because we understand that capitalism, colonialism, white supremacy, and patriarchy emerge together and must be fought jointly. And lastly, we do participatory education because we study the world to change it, and this means developing leaders, not just followers. So here's a little bit about how the seminar is going to work. Each week we will dig into the assigned chapters, first with a lecture component led by Abolition School Coordinator Maher, followed by a discussion and Q&A component facilitated by Abolition School intern DJ and I as well. Sessions will be streamed live on YouTube, where remotely participants will be able to add to the conversation and ask a lot of questions, and recordings of the seminar will later be made available as podcasts both on YouTube and Spotify. For those of you familiar with Abolition School, the format means a little less participation than you may be used to, but we hope to have a significant conversation at the end of each session that you can all participate in. Thank you so much for dedicating your time to studying this essential text and for being a part of this experiment with us. Without further ado, Gio. Thank you.
Thanks to you all for being here. Thanks so much to NECA and DJ for for helping this hybrid seminar come together. It's incredibly complicated, and we're just figuring things out. So we really appreciate you all being a part of it, we appreciate you all being willing to read this text with us. This isn't the first time that we've done a seminar on Black Reconstruction. It's an incredibly important text to us. If you didn't know that we live in the city of Philadelphia, I think as of yesterday, you probably realized it, and that's got a very specific kind of meaning, and it matters a great deal to the Abolition School, which of course we named for Du Bois. And it means a great deal as well to the history of abolition and the history of the Reconstruction Project as well. So being here, being in person with you all is also incredibly important to us. And we also appreciate, of course, all the folks who are tuning in to remotely have this conversation with us, even if they can't make it. At the Abolition School, we take our name from Du Bois and from Black Reconstruction in particular. And for those who aren't aware, the full name of the school is the W.E.B. Du Bois Movement School for Abolition and Reconstruction. And we say that kind of consciously. And by the end of this seminar, I think it'll be pretty clear why it is that we emphasize the Reconstruction piece, and why it has everything to do with Du Bois's own analysis of Reconstruction and our belief that he helps us to understand that we're currently living through the aftermath, the consequences, the long wake of a failed Reconstruction project, or better put, a Reconstruction project that was defeated by white supremacist terrorism. And so we look to this book as a sort of guide for how to think through that project, that failure, and how to think through the necessity for Reconstruction in the present, which we take to mean the radical rebuilding of our society on new foundations. One of the main questions that we confront from the beginning is why it is that we turn to this text, right? I've already said it's important. Again, if you are from Philadelphia or live in Philadelphia, you know that that at any point, at any given moment in Philadelphia, there are sort of 4 or 5 Black Reconstruction reading groups going on across the city. Some of that, of course, has to do with with Du Bois' own time here, his research on the city of Philadelphia, but it also has to do with how central this book is to thinking through the present. So why it is that people are reading and rereading this text has everything to do with the fact that it's not so much a text about a specific historical moment, but it's also a text about and a guide for action in the present, right? And that's really how we want people to begin to think about this book, as large as it is, as significant as it is. And we appreciate you all being willing to dig into almost 800 pages of it to have this conversation. So what are the questions that are really central for us in terms of thinking through the legacies of the present? Why do we read it? Because first of all, the Civil War, as we know, as many of us in this room know, but we're going to sort of dig into more profoundly, was not originally fought to end slavery. That's piece one, right? Neither the North nor the South wanted to abolish slavery. This is an essential piece of what Du Bois is trying to teach us. But the key piece moves beyond that, right? And the really central piece is the fact that as Du Bois tracks this process, it was through the self-activity of enslaved people themselves, right, that the meaning of the war was transformed, right? Again, it was not a war against slavery. It was a war that enslaved people made into a war about slavery and a war to end slavery. That's one major piece. The second piece, of course, is that abolition was followed by a period that we know as Reconstruction. And we'll get into what it is that we may or may not learn about Reconstruction in school and the way that understanding is shaped in a very self-conscious way by white supremacist historians. We'll talk about that today. But for Du Bois, there's a crucial piece to the Reconstruction period, which is the fact that this was an experiment in multiracial egalitarian democracy. It was the most democratic the United States has ever been, was up to the point when he was writing, of course, in 1935. But it's also, I think, it's not much of a leap to say that it was probably the most democratic moment in U.S. history, throughout its existence. And this was because Black self-government, particularly in places like South Carolina and elsewhere, meant universal, accomplishments and a better standard of living and different forms of equality and the development of different forms and institutions to support everyday life of everyone, right? This was a project that didn't simply benefit those who were in power, in other words, Black, formerly enslaved people in particular, but that benefited everyone, right? And so this is a key part of what Reconstruction means as a universal project. We read Black Reconstruction because this short experiment was destroyed, as we've already mentioned, by, on the one hand, the power of capitalism, particularly in the North, and its relationship to white terrorism in the South, particularly of the Klan. And finally, of course, we read this because our current conditions are the fallout of what happens when institutions like slavery are abolished without the transformation of underlying conditions and structures, right? In other words, abolition without Reconstruction, which gives way, as we will see, to the development very quickly of new institutions to replace the old institution of slavery, right? If you don't reconstruct, abolition leads to the repetition of the same, leads to the recreation of new institutions. There are very specific ways that this plays out. Again, this is just basic foreshadowing of things that we're going to talk about throughout the semester. That there was no significant redistribution of land, which meant specifically that formerly enslaved people had no choice but to go onto the capitalist market to sell their labor. And that absent a reconstructed distribution of that land, 40 acres and a mule, for example, in the popular phrase, institutions like sharecropping, continued dispossession on the economic level, but also the criminalization of Black people in particular for categories like vagrancy begin to play a role in developing a new form of slavery for Du Bois. These are all things that we're going to talk about on a far higher level as we dig through Du Bois' historical account. But these are threads that run right through it. And it's all just to underline today why we think in terms of Reconstruction. Why, if we're thinking about in the present saying we are abolitionists, we want to understand what abolition means today, that this means fundamentally that the Reconstruction project has to be tied up with that. This speaks specifically to, different elements of how we already, many of us, have begun to understand what abolition means today. And here we just wanted to sort of, again, frame out different ways in which, a few thinkers or a few contemporary abolitionist intellectuals are putting forward ideas that are grounded in this understanding, right? The short story is that all of these people know this history. All of these people have studied this text, and that's part of why we get things like, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, for example, saying that abolition is presence, not absence, right? In other words, not the withdrawal of an institution, in this case slavery, or in the present moment, police or prisons, but the presence of alternative, different kinds of institutions, right? So when Ruthie says presence, not absence, this is a piece of Reconstruction. When Angela Davis speaks famously of making carceral institutions obsolete, what she means is, what kind of society has no need for police? What kind of society has no need for prisons? Again, Reconstruction is the underlying piece. And of course, what Robin Kelley says in a more straightforward way, that abolition is a form of communism, right? That these two are inseparable phenomena, that you can't actually move to a situation in which police and prisons could be substantively dismantled without a radical reconfiguration of the economic terrain of society, right? If you live in a society based on dramatic economic inequality, if you live on a society structured according to white supremacist fear, if you live in a society in which patriarchal violence is the rule of the day, you will have institutions that develop to uphold those inequalities, right? That's the basic understanding, and that's the basic framing of the way that we think about Reconstruction in conjunction with abolition, right? As a positive supplement, as the idea of what is built in the absence of what needs to be torn down. And this text is really essential for thinking through that. There are many ways to look at the book. There are many different threads that we'll develop and try to disentangle as we move through the semester. I often refer to it as a sort of Rosetta Stone of US history. And for people that know the metaphor of the Rosetta Stone, you're talking about a sort of something that you turn in different directions, and each different direction that you turn it sheds additional light onto the question at hand, right? So you could look at this as a text on the meaning of the Civil War, right? Or you could look at it as a text on the centrality of slavery within the capitalist system, what we call racial capitalism. Or you could look at it as a text about the power of the oppressed to transform through struggle the history of the world, right? It does all of these things, and it does them very, very well, and they're all threaded together. And so these are different pieces of what we're going to be digging out of this book. Again, if this is the edition you get, great. It's the most accessible edition. The PDFs are almost all paginated in the same way. So if you find the ones online, they'll often correlate to the sort of pages that we're using as well. And really, any edition will work. Before we really get into the chapter that we're going to focus on today, we always need to think a little bit about context, right? Context matters in essential ways to thinking through the meaning of what anyone is trying to get across. What is it that they're speaking to? What are the dynamics or the situations that they're trying to confront? And with Du Bois, it's really particularly important because there are two contexts to bear in mind. One is the context he's describing, of course, the period from the 1860s through the 1870s, and then the moment in which he's writing, which is the 1930s, right? And he's got a foot in both of those periods, and he's got an eye on both of those sort of moments in history. So he's writing 90 years ago, and he's writing about a period that came 70 years before that. Very interesting for us to then try to think about the way that that maps onto our context. His context is a very specific one, right? Politically, it's a period marked by Jim Crow segregation in the US South, right? A period in which the claim that the Civil War didn't mark the end of white supremacy would have been very obvious to him and others, and yet not to many historians, as we'll talk about a bit today. Not only was Du Bois writing in a context of Jim Crow in the South, but he's also writing in a context of US imperialism on the international level. And this is something he's very, very aware of. And we'll get to the ways in which one of the sort of understated elements of this text is its international piece. It's important to understand that the Jim Crow segregation was crucial for the actual composition of the book, meaning that Du Bois educated at the finest universities, a professor at incredibly important universities as well, himself could not travel to and access many of the documents that needed to be accessed to write this text. Right? We'll talk more about the ways that that documents were destroyed, that archives were destroyed and after the process of Reconstruction. But it's important to realize that he's writing this text, this 800-page text, based on just what he could access, right? And that access was incredibly limited. On an economic level, Du Bois is writing in the context of the Great Depression. This is crucial for a bunch of reasons, not only the context of the New Deal, in other words, a project for social reconstruction of some kind, but which is still in some ways a white supremacist inflected project despite everything. But also because Du Bois himself, as he's writing this book, which was not supposed to be nearly this long, which was meant to be, I think, 300 pages. That was the length that was originally contracted. He had a hard time getting it published. He had a hard time getting it printed. It was expensive to print. It was expensive to purchase. And so that put a real limitation on the reception of the book and the degree to which this book would actually be read. It's important also then to understand the context of this text within Du Bois' own political development. Now, people have probably heard a lot about Du Bois, have more likely read texts like The Souls of Black Folk, which is an earlier text written in and around the turn of the 20th century. This book is written in 1935. It's not the end of his career, but it's toward the end. And we get here the sort of mature, relatively mature Du Bois. He's someone who has developed on a number of levels, shifting roughly from slightly more, what we can understand roughly as a slightly more liberal individualist orientation early in his career, often criticized for upholding a thesis referred to often as the talented 10th, meaning that among the Black community, it's the 10th, the 10% who are most educated, more elite, who are going to help play a role in saving the rest, right? He's shifting away from that towards something that's much more radical, that's much more based in mass struggle and mass mobilization, that plays a great deal more attention to this question of economic reconstruction, right? The economic aspect. All of that is to say that he's becoming, in a lot of ways, more of a Marxist. He, is a Marxist of a type when he writes this book. He's very clearly using and deploying Marxist categories. One of the things, though, that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to is the degree to which he does that in a way that's faithful to the Marxism that he confronts, and the degree to which he's transforming Marxism in the process. Does that make sense? So he's shifting, right? He's shifting toward a Pan-Africanist internationalism, toward a global Marxism, and ultimately, Du Bois leaves the US. He dies in Ghana, and he dies, I believe, the day before Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So there's this very interesting historical moment that he's living through, that he's inhabiting, and that then leads us to, to this sort of position where he's writing this book. Is everything good on the tech side? Okay. So we've got Du Bois writing this later in his career, in the middle of his career. And I do want to note and emphasize the fact that this book doesn't do everything. It's an incredibly important book. For some of us, it's one of the most important books we could read to help orient ourselves. And yet, it doesn't do everything that we would want it to do. His specific goals are incredibly ambitious. We'll get a little bit more into those today, but his goals are also constraining to him in some ways. He's trying to argue against university historians. He's trying to argue against a prevailing sort of intellectual status quo. He's trying to rewrite the history of Reconstruction. And that makes for a huge book, but it also makes for a book that doesn't have room for everything, right? He's also very interested in the state, right? State level discussions, state level debates in the Reconstruction, within the Reconstruction government. He's interested in the centrality that enslaved people have on an economic level which is to say, and I just want to sort of foreground this, the centrality within capitalism, right? Within capitalist accumulation. And I note both of these pieces, the state and capitalism, to say that there's ways that he's trying to make arguments that lead him to write a story that appears to be within the existing order. And yet there are ways in which his account also gets beyond that. We also, though, want to be aware of the fact that there are also absences in this text that are probably related to Du Bois's own positions, his own prejudices, his own outlooks. There's not much in this book about settler colonialism and indigenous sort of history and struggle, right? As a inevitable and invisible backdrop to everything he's kind of describing. There are some clear gendered critiques that can be made of this text, although we want to be aware of the degree to which Du Bois is speaking in terms that apply, very much across genders. So it's all to say, not everything is in here. It's not the perfect book. It's not everything we would expect, but it's also an incredibly powerful book, right? And we want to dig out that power, and we want to do so in a way that's coherent. I think the last thing I want to say really before we get into it is just a little bit about like how to read Du Bois. Has anyone read this book before? A little bit. Has anyone read other books by Du Bois? Yeah. And there's, I think, some general things to say, right? One is that if you read something like Souls of Black Folk, it's a very kind of short, poetic book, heavy on sort of rhetorical flow, on sort of the emotive nature of the way that Du Bois is writing. And this is a very different book, mostly because it's got hundreds and hundreds of pages of like history, right? There's long quotations from legislative debates in South Carolina, etc. It doesn't make for as engaging, of a text. You still have the sort of stylistic elements of Souls of Black Folk in here, but they're sort of interspersed with that history. And I say that all to say that one key element of how to read this book effectively is to pay attention to those moments, right? The moments where Du Bois shifts gears, when he starts to write in a more sort of flowing and poetic way, when he starts to speak very synthetically, right? He's trying to sort of gloss the entire arc of the Civil War and Reconstruction, or of the specific, dynamic of the chapter that he's talking about. So just pay attention when he gets into that mode, right? And it's usually at the beginning of the chapters and at the end of the chapters. I'll also say, and this is very much related, that if you look at the beginning of each chapter, they have these little chapter sort of outlines. And they're really incredibly important. There's so much you can learn just by looking at the way that a chapter outline is framed, the way that in like 50 short words or something like that, it says so much, and it says it in an incredibly intentional way. And we'll start to sort of practice that a little bit today as we start to think about the chapter that we're going to be talking about. Cool? Awesome. So we're actually going to begin before the text starts with this just one page onto the reader. If people have the text in front of you, cool. Otherwise, you don't have to. You can pick it up. And we'll put a little bit up here as well. Again, this is a one-page sort of preface that Du Bois is offering to the text. And it's worth just spending a little bit of time with and sitting with a little bit. It does two really important and fundamental things. The first happens really in the first paragraph. The story of transplanting millions of Africans to the New World and of their bondage for 4 centuries is a fascinating one. Particularly interesting for students of human culture is the sudden freeing of these Black folk in the 19th century and the attempt through them to reconstruct the basis of American democracy. And I emphasize that piece, the attempt through them to reconstruct the basis of American democracy. Now, the original title of this book was not accepted by the publisher, and it was Black Reconstruction of Democracy in America. And there's a couple of things happening there. One is that, you've got this very famous book written in like the 1820s by a traveling French philosopher, Tocqueville, if people read political theory, called Democracy in America. It's a celebratory sort of tale of American democracy and all of its sort of progressive elements from a Frenchman who had come to see it and observe it and see how much better it was than what was developing in France. Of course, post-revolutionary France. It's worth understanding. And it's interesting because that book is kind of the same size as this, but there's this very funny segregation where you get to the end of this account of how amazing American democracy is, and there are these chapters on the three races in America and white supremacy, and the fact that Tocqueville actually could see that is a sort of deadly threat to American democracy is in there, but it's all right at the end of the book, right? You don't get the understanding that that's part of and a heart of the story. So on the one hand, the Black reconstruction of democracy in America could be read as a critique of that celebratory account. But then the more important piece of what Du Bois is doing is to say that Black Americans in their struggles reconstructed American democracy, right? And not just reconstructed, but really established it. There's moments where he puts it in that sort of stronger kind of way. There's a huge amount of agency, power built into that. So we'll pay a lot of attention to who it is that's capable of building democracy, providing it, making it real, and of the ways in which, according to Du Bois, the way he puts it, there are phrases where he says, democracy died, saving the souls of Black folk, right? Seeing Black Americans as a reservoir of democratic faith and democratic practice, right? Even when the rest of the country had forgotten about it, had abandoned it. So that's this piece right here. To reconstruct the basis of American democracy. Again, this was rejected by the publisher. This is something that we'll return to that relates to the question of propaganda, that relates to the ways in which certain kinds of arguments are unacceptable or illegible, and the ways that Du Bois has actually confronted that before. The second piece, though, if you go further down in the to the reader, is this last paragraph. And here, this is where Du Bois says, it would be only fair to the reader to say frankly in advance that the attitude of any person toward this story will be distinctly influenced by his theories of the Negro race. If he believes that the Negro in America and in general is an average and ordinary human being who under given environment develops like other human beings, then he will read this story and judge it by the facts adduced. If, however, he regards the Negro as a distinctly inferior creation who can never successfully take part in modern civilization and whose emancipation and enfranchisement were gestures against nature, then he will need something more than the sort of facts that I have set down. But this latter person, I'm not trying to convince. This latter person, I'm not trying to convince. So the second piece he's saying to the readers, he's like, listen, there are certain people who will not get anything out of this book, right? There are certain people who I don't want to read this book, who don't need to read this book, who would maybe be a waste for them to read this book. And it's people who believe, or specifically do not believe, that Black Americans are ordinary human beings, right? And that piece is incredibly key for Du Bois, right? He says ordinary human beings on purpose. He's talking about, and he'll, repeat this, this insistence that he's not trying to say that, formerly enslaved people during the Reconstruction era were, as he puts it, saints, right? He's saying they behaved exactly as other people would under the environmental constraints that they confronted, right? The realities that they were up against. So this ordinary human beings is crucial, right? This book is not for certain people. It is for other people who understand that people are people, that they act as human beings, given the context. From To the Reader, though, we go to the last chapter. Chapter 17, The Propaganda of History. And one of the questions, of course, is why do we begin at the end? And it's in part to think a little bit more about and understand from the outset what it is that Du Bois is trying to accomplish. To think a little bit about the title of the chapter, Propaganda of History, to think about how those two pieces fit together. And to think again, the way that propaganda and history operate in the context of the debates around Reconstruction. Again, the rough story, the rough gloss on the period of Reconstruction is that it was, to some degree, and in different degrees in different states, a period of Black self-government, right? As we'll see, South Carolina was the example of the Black majority state that elected a Black majority legislature that led to the most radical experiments in Reconstruction. And other states are sort of less radical variants of that, right? But we're talking about a story about Black self-government. We're talking about the ability of formerly enslaved Black Americans to govern themselves and to govern others in a way that was effective. And what Du Bois is confronting is an ideological historical narrative that demonizes Reconstruction, that claims that it was ultimately a mistake. There are different ways that it claims that it was a mistake, and that it should be forgotten. It was an unfortunate experience within American democracy. Of course, we've already seen Du Bois say himself that this was the high point of American democracy. So we've got radically differing perspectives here. And so we begin with Du Bois' attempt to dismantle that existing and prevailing truth. This was not Du Bois' first rodeo when it came to this question, or when it came even to the title of the book. The publisher's not accepting Black Reconstruction of Democracy in America. He had written a piece for Encyclopedia Britannica that was rejected, and that he ultimately, I believe, withdrew because it was, the editors wanted to cut too much out of it, right? And he even mentions it in this chapter when he's speaking about the demonization of Reconstruction. This is on page 713. He says, the editors of the 14th edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica asked me for an article on the history of the American Negro. From my manuscript, they cut out all my references to Reconstruction. I insisted on including the following statement, quote, white historians have ascribed the faults and failures of Reconstruction to Negro ignorance and corruption, but the Negro insists that it was Negro loyalty and the Negro vote alone that restored the South to the Union, established the new democracy, both for white and Black, and instituted the public schools. That right there is this very concise summary of a lot of what this book is about, right? And this was precisely why this could not be published, right? In the Encyclopedia Britannica. The editor refused. And so Du Bois, from a very early stage, had been confronting this question around Reconstruction. And in many ways, it was this rejection that motivated him to write this fuller history, right? What's ironic is that he went on to write almost 800 pages, and it was still widely attacked, right? It was still seen as partisan. It was still seen as angry, right? Some of the reviews describe this book as angry. And yet he's really just laying out, facts and realities. We'll get to, what that looks like. But as you see in this last chapter, and he's analyzing textbooks, right? He's analyzing books written by university professors, books that are provided to public school children. In other words, these are the mechanisms of how ideology is institutionalized, right? Ideology is not just bad ideas, it's bad ideas institutionalized, built into schools, delivered into homes, upheld by political organizations, churches, media, right? This is how ideology becomes a very real material phenomenon. In this case, we're talking about textbooks, right? We're talking about the fact that, and here's an interesting sort of material piece to bear in mind, he's critiquing and confronting what's often summarized as the Dunning School. This is based on a professor at Columbia at the time that centers on interpretation of Reconstruction and more broadly on slavery, right? Some of the aspects of, the Dunning School approach to thinking were that enslaved people weren't actually too upset with their conditions. They kind of liked it. They benefited from aspects of the sort of patriarchal family that slavery provided. As a result, and one of the main arguments is that enslaved people did not rebel very often, which was a lie. And when it comes to Reconstruction, that this was too much, too quick of an attempt to free enslaved people. Again, the more generous views were like people were just simply not prepared. It should happen gradually. And as a result, what you see is, and this is the summaries that Du Bois is offering at the very beginning, that, according to some historians and some textbooks, Black people were inherently ignorant, incapable of self-government. Right? And you can go right through these bullet points. Some arguments said that they were lazy, dishonest, and extravagant. And so you'll see in the text, he spends a great deal of time talking about corruption in each of the states. And again, thinking back to ordinary human beings, he's never trying to say there was no corruption. He's often trying to show that the sources of that corruption were in capitalism, that the main actors in that corruption were actually white businessmen, right? And that on a very, very fundamental level, formerly enslaved people behaved no differently in that context than anyone else. In other words, white people were corrupt, black people were corrupt. He's trying to show that, right? And so when you see him spending a lot of time talking about corruption, this is why, right? Because this is part of the mainstream narrative that he's trying to confront. That the negative elements of Reconstruction governments were the fault of formerly enslaved people and of black people in particular. The abolitionists themselves, the sort of carpetbaggers and others, the influence of the North played a role in whipping up this demand for a rapid abolition and for radical demands for Reconstruction. And here you see a variant of what's often referred to as the outside agitator narrative, right? Again, thinking back to the main myths of slavery itself, the idea that enslaved people were fundamentally happy, and therefore, if they resisted, it must have been someone else intervening, right? So you see this repeated in the Reconstruction period, where it must be influences from the North that are sort of encouraging people. In this context, there's a sort of apology for Klan violence, right? Because the Klan was simply responding to the fact that things had gone too far, right? All of this is built into this piece, and it's important to understand that there are two radically different, not radically different, I'll take that back, two different pieces of how this narrative operates, right? Roughly liberal and reactionary, right? And this is probably very familiar. This is a very familiar kind of distinction and bifurcation where you've got liberals or you've got reactionaries sort of openly demonizing, openly white supremacist, embracing the sort of most straightforward forms of racism. And then you've got liberals saying, well, like there wasn't enough education ahead of time or things moved too quickly, right? And so presenting in a certain way enslaved people as incapable and an object of pity as opposed to an object of aggression. This is the foundation of the propaganda that Du Bois is trying to confront. And he says that the propaganda is grounded in shame. The shame takes two different forms depending on who is espousing it. Again, the reactionary Confederates of the South versus the sort of maybe liberals of the North and elsewhere who feel two different kinds of shame, right? On the one hand, of course, the South feels a shame at having lost, feels a shame that we feel right up to the present at having been governed by people that it had denounced as incapable of doing so, right? It had to demonize that. It had to, for example, burn the archives. It had to denounce all accomplishments of Reconstruction. It needed a framework for doing that. But you also had the North, right, that felt embarrassed, as Du Bois would have it, that it needed to be saved by Black Americans. Right? There's a deep shame and a deep embarrassment built into that. And so the narrative and the history actually had to be, transformed. The transformation of that occurs fundamentally through what Du Bois describes on page 721, I think. The chief witness in Reconstruction, the emancipated slave himself, has been almost barred from court, right? These two forms of shame, the kind of propaganda that they uphold, operates on the basis of eliminating, expelling from the very debate the actual protagonist, according to Du Bois. Again, most people, white Southerners and Northerners alike, would not admit that enslaved people were the protagonist of this struggle. That's a key element of this story. But what he's trying to show is the fact that that had to be excluded, right? Not only in the history textbooks, but also with the active decision to burn Reconstruction archives, right? So the history itself benefits from that material destruction of these archives. One of the key questions that this chapter raises, though, is the question of how we understand propaganda and how we understand what it means to confront propaganda. And again, just to foreground a little bit, these are incredibly crucial questions for today, right? We live in a moment in which, on the one hand, the far right is actively engaging in, I don't even know how to describe it, and propaganda is not the right word, but right, a refusal and a refusal to take seriously basic elements of truth and scientific reality. Right? This is true, and yet we have in this denunciation and diagnosis of a sort of post-truth world under Trump, a very comforting liberal idea that there's a reality that we all agree to, that we all could agree to, right? And so you've got this tension over the question of propaganda, right? Propaganda isn't always and in all communities understood to be a bad thing, right? If you're in Latin America, for example, it's very often, built right into the language that when you say, oh no, like I'm an organizer, I do propaganda work, I do ideological work. These aren't negative, right? Ideology, propaganda. They're simply elements of reality, right? And the question is how to navigate those. And so we look at the way that Du Bois wants to think about these questions, and we look at this, particularly this chunk on page 722, where Du Bois is he's actually struggling with this question. And this is why I think it's super interesting. And of course, part of the question is how do we understand these ideas? And then part of the question is how do we interpret Du Bois locating himself, right? With relation to propaganda and the propaganda of history. This is in the middle of 722. And he's speaking about these roles and functions. In the first place, somebody in each era must make clear the facts with utter disregard to his own wish and desire and belief. What we've got to know so far as possible are the things that actually happened in the world. Then, with that much clear and open to every reader, the philosopher and prophet has a chance to interpret these facts. But the historian has no right, posing as a scientist, to conceal and distort facts. And until we distinguish between these two functions of the chronicler of human action, we're going to render it easy for a muddled world out of sheer ignorance to make the same mistake 10 times over. So Du Bois is talking about 4 different roles and functions here. 4 approaches to thinking through history. Historian, propagandist, philosopher, and prophet. Historian, propagandist, philosopher, and prophet. I can fix that really quick. It's over here. Sorry about that, everyone. He's naming these 4 different roles, but it's not totally clear where he locates himself. And we're left with this really interesting question. Is he a historian? Is he a propagandist? Is he a philosopher? Is he a prophet? He's clearly more than just a historian. And yet he centers this really important historical role, right? He says the historian's first job is to lay out the facts. Again, do we agree on the facts? Are the facts untainted by material dynamics, by class interests, by white supremacy? What are the facts that we're trying to lay out? Again, is the role of a propagandist not crucial when you're someone like Du Bois, who worked ceaselessly in publishing, in journalism, in criticism, who organized in political organizations and parties? Is that not propaganda work? And then, of course, Du Bois is a philosopher and he's also a prophet. So what are we to do and what are we to make, I think, of this question? These are really, really interesting pieces that need to be sort of laid out and brought into this story. And there are different ways to look at it, right? And just to name like a couple. One is that we could say he doesn't control his own relationship to these categories. I guess the way I'll put it is, again, he wrote 800 pages here and it's still not considered by some of his moment to be proper history. So can he even, is he writing on such a defensive perspective where he has to convince the world that this is history by making claims to objectivity in this way, right? To say, I am only laying out the facts. I'm not a prophet. I'm not a philosopher. Again, does he do that tactically? Does he do it strategically? Another piece is that we could look at him, and I think this is pretty convincing, as approaching objectivity by kind of weeding out clear lies, by weeding out certain kinds of propaganda, right? And this is something that I think, again, we do every day, right? We don't agree with everything the liberals are saying about Trump, but at the same time, we know that there's certain fundamental things that are being misstated every day. that simply don't conform to reality. So we, I think, find ourselves navigating these pieces every day, and that's part of why we need to understand it. And then another piece I think to bear in mind is that he, again, is a Marxist, right, at this point. And so he's incorporating certain understandings of objectivity on the one hand, meaning that there's a kind of objective reality in the world, but also a powerful analysis that Marxism provides of ideology and propaganda, right? So there's a kind of nuanced way that the two of these kind of play out in their conjunction. But this is just a question to have in our heads as we look at the history and the way that he writes it, as he goes from that sort of mode of recounting history to this very poetic and flowing sort of piece. And these are just questions for us to have, in our minds as we move forward. Is history neutral? Is propaganda bad? How do we see this progressive and self-congratulatory notion of history today, right? As Du Bois says, how do we see this idea that we need to erase the shame of the past rather than restating it, right? How do we see the sanitizing of history that happens? Again, part of the narrative of the shame is that we don't talk about the things that we did wrong in the past because we want to act as if we've all gotten here magically to a present, without anyone having been wrong. There's a really great quote he has. I forget if it's I forget where it is exactly. It's this quote where he says something like, "No one ever did anything wrong. Like somehow, like we've gotten to the present without anyone ever having been actually wrong." Top of 723. Yeah. Anyway, it's such a great quote. I wish I could find it off the top. But it's essentially that, right? It's that, somehow nothing is going wrong. But we can think about when we think in the present, we think about things like the way in which the civil rights movement is presented to us, right? As a struggle, sure, but as a sort of part of an inevitable progression of history, right? And part of what we are constantly trying to remind ourselves and others about is the fact that many of the same people who were opposed to that struggle back then, are still here and are making the same kinds of arguments in the present. Right? And the way that leads to this, again, this very, on the one hand, this smooth, progressive analysis of history where history is always moving forward. This is a view that's shared by kind of liberalism and by a certain kind of Marxism alike, where they're both moving forward, but in very different dynamics. And part of what Du Bois is analyzing is the fact that, listen, like, history doesn't move forward for Black Americans, right? There's no inevitable progress. There's this moment of opportunity, which, will, come to this very famous phrase that Du Bois uses in the first chapter, where he says, a moment in which Black people walked free, stood for a moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery, right? That's the arc of the story. It's not one of progress. And so how do you manage that on a historical level is part of the question. If you go over to page 725, actually, 727. Mm-hmm. 714. Thank you so much. We're on 714. It's in here, regardless. We'll find it next week, I'm sure. If you go over to 727, we find where Du Bois is really leaning into his poetic, narrative capacities, right? And this is this chapter is kind of like an appendix. It's not really a conclusion when we get all the way back through the book toward the chapter on back towards slavery. That's a bit more of a conclusion, but here he's still writing as if it were a conclusion, right? And doing so with an eye to this question of propaganda and history. So this is the bottom of 727. It's just really, there's going to be moments where I'm just like reading what Du Bois is saying and writing and just marveling at how beautiful it is, because it's really incredible. So please bear with me when I'm just reading it. The most magnificent drama in the last 1,000 years of human history is the transportation of 10 million human beings out of the dark beauty of their mother continent into a newfound El Dorado of the West. They descended into hell. And in the 3rd century, they arose from the dead, in the finest effort to achieve democracy for the working millions which this world had ever seen. It was a tragedy that beggared the Greek. It was an upheaval of humanity like the Reformation and the French Revolution, yet we are the blind and led by the blind. And if you turn over to 728. One reads the truer, deeper facts of Reconstruction with a great despair. It is at once so simple and human and yet so futile. There's no villain, no idiot, no saint. There are just men who crave ease and power, men who know want and hunger, men who have crawled. They all dream and strive with an ecstasy of fear and strain and effort balked of hope and hate. Yet the rich world is wide enough for all, wants all, needs all. So slight a gesture, a word, might set the strife in order, not with full content, but with growing dawn of fulfillment. Instead roars the crash of hell. And after its whirlwind, a teacher sits in academic halls, learned in the tradition of its elms and its elders. And this is, of course, the intellectual, the academic who writes the history books, who denounces those efforts to build equality. And I'm going to read the last 2 paragraphs. And of course, these are very difficult paragraphs to read, and so please forgive that. Immediately in Africa, a black back runs red with the blood of the lash. In India, a brown girl is raped. In China, a coolie starves. In Alabama, 7 darkies are more than lynched, while in London, the white limbs of a prostitute are hung with jewels and silk. Flames of jealous murder sweep the earth, while brains of little children smear the hills. This is education in the 1935th year of the Christ. This is modern and exact social science. This is the university course in History 12 set down by the Senatus Academicus. The most sort of horrifying brutality that you could imagine is, as Du Bois is arguing, built into, accepted, and understood to be part of history as this propagandistic version allows, right? This is what he's up against. This is the kind of story he's trying to tell and retell, and this is why it's important for him to confront it. Again, this is not, on the one hand, it's incredibly objective, but on the other hand, it's not something that goes without interpretation. The fundamental question is the question that begins the text, right? In the To the Reader, which is to say, which side of this divide are you on? Are you on the side that believes that all people, all humans are fundamentally human? Or are you on the side that ascribes to some kind of biological division in which other people are not capable of engaging in history, in government, on the same level, right? These divisions, what you could call ontological divisions, divisions that cut across the level of being and existence, where some people are fully human and fully being and others are just merely exist. This division is what's reproduced. We call it white supremacy. It's founded in colonialism across the globe. And it's used to divide not only workers from each other, it's used to distinguish which of those laborers can be hyper-exploited, can be worked to death in the mines of Latin America, for example, worked to death on plantations. And it's an ontological division that for Du Bois upholds this question of propaganda right to the end of the text. So that's chapter 17, right? This is what he's up against. We're going to circle back to the beginning for next week. But first, I want to, engage with some questions that you all may have in the room, questions that folks may have on the stream as well. Folks in the room want to start. DJ is going to have
Yeah, I'm gonna come around with a little
microphone.
mic. If you feel comfortable, say your name and pronouns. But if not, you can remain anonymous. It's completely up to you.
Hi, I'm Steph, she, her. I just wanted to know if you could level set a little bit around Marxism, just because you've been like
Mhm.
mentioning it a lot. Just
Mhm.
curious.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so for folks that didn't maybe hear it, the question of just setting a baseline, as I understand it, for what do we mean by Marxism? How is it part of this story? Um, and it's important in part because Du Bois. Part of what we're going to get to is the way that Du Bois uses Marxism and transforms it while he's using it. Right. Marxism, of course, is a rough understanding and analysis of the way that capitalism operates as a global, history. And it offers crucial insights to how we understand the economic processes of that. It's also, though, built on observations that are based in a very specific part of the world, specifically Northern Europe, right? And so part of what Du Bois is engaging in is something that many third world non-Western Marxists have always done, which is to find inspiration in Marxism and um, push back on the way that certain categories are understood, and to push back in the process of using them. This is sort of foregrounding just a little bit, right? But one of the questions for next week is why are his first two chapters, which are called The Black Worker and The White Worker, um, why are they called that? Why are they separate chapters? Why does he use the language of worker to begin with? Why does he not say enslaved people and white workers? What is he doing by calling them both workers? And what is he also doing by putting them into different chapters, right? And one of the underlying questions is going to be, what is he doing by using that language at all to describe enslaved people, right? What is he doing by describing the centrality of the system of chattel slavery in the US, within the US capitalist economy and within the global economy? And again, I've hinted at this phrase, which is racial capitalism. It's a very common phrase today. It's usually used to describe thinkers like Ruthie Wilson Gilmore and Robin Kelley. They in many ways developed this on the basis of Cedric Robinson, who wrote a great book called Black Marxism and taught many of them how to think about these questions. And the fundamental lesson of racial capitalism is that capitalism was always racial. It always had some kind of racial piece built into it. And for Robinson, this goes back to even before colonialism. And the fundamental piece for us is the ways in which they place race at the center of the way that global capitalism operates. Again, capitalism expands across the globe through colonialism, but it also does so by developing an incredibly useful for capitalists, a useful division of communities, races, made up categories of people, right? Which allows them to then say, these people work under these conditions, these people work under these conditions, right? It does a couple of really important things for capitalism, which is to allow for, again, what I've called hyper-exploitation, right? The fact that you could exploit certain people and treat them in certain ways that wouldn't be accepted in other parts of the world. And it creates, on a very political level, an incredibly useful division between and among workers. This is going to be a key undercurrent to what Du Bois is talking about here. So that's, I think, part of what I would say in terms of setting this out, right? Marxism for him means looking at underlying economic categories. It means mapping what's happening in the US, not simply according to race and racism or politics and political power, but also according to economic function, right? But for him to do that always brings in the question of white supremacy and its functional incorporation into capitalism, if that makes sense. Again, that's a great question. It's going to be a huge part of the way he lays out the whole story.
Just for clarity, we're going to be going from one question from the chat to one question in person and back and forth. So another question that we have from the chat is just kind of an overall really big want to discuss the idea of Du Bois being a prophet. So people just wondering if you could just explain more about that and just expound on it as you want, so on and so forth. And then there's also like another question that I feel like, have you ever read White Freedom by Tyler Stovall? That's the end of the question. So it's kind of two questions. If you need me to repeat them, I can. Just let me know.
Yeah, I'll definitely focus on the prophet piece. I think that I've seen the book, but it's something people can check out. I'll note it down here as well to remember. And and the question of whether Du Bois is a prophet, I think is really interesting. It strikes me as true, right? It strikes me that he is doing all of these things at once. That when you read him, he is not only operating. This raises a question that often comes up in these conversations about Black Reconstruction, but also about Du Bois in general, about the importance of religious metaphors, the importance of religious frameworks, the importance of spirituals, particularly in a book like Souls, but also, the way that sort of our religious reference points play out in this text is really, really important. And for me, I think it's important not to ever reduce those frames to religion as we understand it, right? But to think about them as keys for thinking through what we could maybe understand as the sort of less rational motivations for action, right? That people are not motivated by what we are often told in a very sort of Western, you know, particularly economic, context, as a sort of calculating individualism, right? People don't act that way throughout history. People don't, they're very interested in survival, and as he puts it, comfort and ease. But they're also interested in things like freedom. They're also interested in things like dignity, things that are much harder to sort of quantify. And so when you see Du Bois talking about these questions and trying to map kind of human motivation, he does take on a more prophetic tone, I think, right? Again, philosopher, what does a philosopher do? If we're talking about these sort of four functions, a philosopher tends to think about basic categories of existence, again, whether it's being or, just very sort of like fundamental dynamics of how our world operates, but on the most profound and conceptual level, you see him doing that. And again, propaganda seems the more sort of crass of these categories, but it's one that we all engage in propaganda on a certain level. The question is whether or not you understand your propaganda to point toward maybe a deeper truth or towards something more like a prophetic call for transformation, if that makes sense. And I guess I kind of see them all as intertwined in that way. What other questions do folks have? It's so quiet in here.
I think my question was, so in this chapter, it's sort of summarized with like, here's an overview of what all the white
Yeah.
And they're great. But I'm kind of curious what his black contemporaries are up to. Sort of like black intellectual work.
Yeah.
He is engaging in, if he's ever like low-key calling out something that he thinks is dumb, something like that. So, what sort of black contemporaries?
That's a great question. Again, for people that didn't hear, it's a question of the propaganda that he's confronting is heavily white propaganda. Absolutely. And I think there's different ways to look at this. And the question, I think the implication is what is left out of this propaganda and what were other sort of black contemporaries engaging, with. This gets very much to his own, again, propaganda work. He's, doing journalism, he's writing, he's engaged in some of the harshest debates that you could probably imagine. And again, many of you may know about some of these. He was not a well-liked person, right? Du Bois was not someone who got along very well with his contemporaries. Even if you agreed with him, he probably came off as incredibly obnoxious. And so he's engaged in these debates and discussions. I think there's two main things I would want to say about that. One, I think, is, again, maybe I'm overreading it as being built into your question, but I think it's true, which is to say that this is an example of Du Bois being, trying to accomplish a task on the level of the argument that limits his framework a little bit, right? He is very concerned with dismantling the prevailing interpretation of Reconstruction. And that interpretation of Reconstruction is set by white scholars in the academy. I think that's the reality of it. And that's, so you could say on the one hand, of course, that's what he's focused on. On the other hand, what else is there, right? And does that lead him to be too focused on that? And maybe that's a bit of an exaggerated kind of way to put it, but that will come up with like other pieces of like how he understands Reconstruction. Again, is he so focused on the state legislature? What's he missing that's happening on the grassroots level? What's he missing in the other debates? So I take that to be part of your question. I think that's true. On the other hand, his main contemporary debates that he's engaging with are very much with other thinkers and intellectuals who are vying for this role of being, the intellectual who can interpret Black existence and Black political reality, right? And I'm trying to put it in a broad sense, but it's real, right? And again, that's also mediated by white society, right? Who is accepted, who is embraced, and specifically, he's in conflict with Booker T. Washington, right? As people may know, right? There are different ways to look at the debate. Very roughly, though, Booker T. Washington is arguing for a kind of economic uplift in the Black community through labor and work and vocational schools. And at least for an early Du Bois, you could see Booker T. Washington as a correction to something that Du Bois himself was missing, where he was focused on higher education for Black elites in particular, in Ivy League settings, right? So you could see Booker T. Washington as offering some kind of moderate corrective on that level, but Du Bois develops this economic piece by the time we're writing this book, right? He develops an understanding of the material necessities and preconditions for freedom, right? Which is land, right? Economic equality. These are the kind of things that need to be developed. His main critique, though, is of the ways in which someone like Booker T. Washington is embraced by the white power structure, specifically because he's willing to say, okay, Black people don't need political freedom, don't need to run elections, don't need to hold political power, and don't need higher education, right? Classical education, intellectual education. So while you could find maybe something useful or powerful, part of what's, in Booker T. Washington's strategy, and the need to develop economic self-sufficiency is kind of undeniable. But for Du Bois, what's being sacrificed is not worth it, right? And he's saying, again, Black Americans are ordinary human beings who should be able to engage in politics and higher learning, even if it's not immediately economically valuable to them, right? Need to be able to develop a sort of political culture and a sphere of political debate in journalism and these other kinds of things. So he is engaged on that level, and he's certainly engaged in many more questions. If you look at the sort of journalism that he's doing, if you look at the crisis and other sort of like outlets, they're talking about international struggles. They're talking about Latin American struggles. This is part of this story as well, the internationalist piece. And he's engaging in all of this, right? And again, I think that's very connected to the propaganda work as well. Yeah.
Moving on, there's another question from the chat. This says, quote, maybe this is a better cover for another week, but I'm curious about how this book is in dialogue with social movements at the time. Marxist unions, Black culture movements, etc. And then building on to that, another person asked, especially how this book's analysis was engaged within the CPUSA, and especially folks like Harry Haywood, Claudia Jones, and other Black communists.
Yeah.
So kind of just asking about like how,
Yeah, it's a great question. How is it connected to movements? How is it related then to like official channels of communism? These are really, really good questions. I mean, connected to movements, it's a good question because he's really trying to provide an alternative textbook, right? He's not, it would be, I think, an exaggeration. People say this about Marx and Capital sometimes, right? Where it's like, oh, Marx wrote Capital for workers to read. And I don't know, I'm not entirely certain that that's true, right? It's like he writes it as an overarching analysis and diagnostic of the capitalist system, which can be used in many different ways by many different people, but which is unlikely to be, sat down and read by everyday workers in the, in the evening, right? I think something similar could be said about this, right? He's trying to accomplish multiple things, but one is on the highest level of intellectual society, which is to contest and defeat and destroy a certain view of what Reconstruction meant. And the goal is that will then, trickle down into the way that movements are able to struggle and are able to sort of engage. And that sort of effect is always present, right? And again, he's writing articles about this. He's writing encyclopedia entries about this. He's trying to get this to become the new common sense about Reconstruction that, again, it wasn't a mistake. It was the high point of American democracy. It was an incredible moment of possibility that was then defeated by white supremacist sort of like terrorism. So that, I think, is what he's doing. And it's all to say that it's connected to what movements are doing simultaneously, but not directly and unmediated like part of what, that kind of propaganda work would look like and that organizing is looking like. In relation to something like the official CP, the official Communist Party, there's always overlap and also tension, right? And I want to be just really clear here that this is not tension that is limited to Du Bois, right? If you look at, and I don't want to speak too generally, but if you look at third world Marxism, if you look at black Marxists across different trajectories and different contexts, many struggle with official communist parties because they feel as if those parties don't really reflect on and grasp what black existence means and looks like, right? And what struggles for black freedom mean for broader struggles. There's a manner of seeing these as particular elements, whereas the real struggle is over here and it's about economics. And that's not how Du Bois would see it. That's not how someone like Fanon would see it, or someone like C.L.R. James, or someone like, Richard Wright, right? And many of these people, Aimé Césaire, were members of communist parties and then quit those communist parties, usually around the same time in the 40s and the 50s, because they said this party is not the right vehicle for understanding how black struggle can, be a leading force on a global level. So a good bunch of what, and again, this is part of the undercurrent of this book, of this sort of broader discussion we're going to have, is that what he's doing with Marxism here is not what's generally accepted by communist parties. It's not traditional Marxism. It's not orthodox Marxism. It is a kind of Marxism that exists in that tradition, but only outside of the constraints of what those party structures often accept. Now, with that all said, the part of what's so frustrating about the history of communist parties across the globe is that the policies really veer wildly back and forth depending on dictates that are coming from the Communist International, elements of Leninism, on what Stalin's rise to power means for these communist parties, and it's not all clear, right? One of the under-recognized elements of what official Soviet, communism provided was a centrality of the importance of the question of race and the question of the black belt in the U.S. context, right? And it was above all communist parties that were defending the black belt thesis that said, listen, majority black areas of the U.S. South should be governed by black people, right? And the withdrawal of support, from communist parties was, incredibly detrimental to that. And it's really important to think about those experiments. Robin Kelly has a great book called Hammer and Hoe. If you haven't read it, amazing book, which shows all of these tensions and all of these contradictions, but also the incredibly important role that the Communist Party played in specifically organizing, black workers in the U.S. South. So it's worth looking at that. Du Bois himself was not as officially connected, right? Sympathetic, knew people, connected to these people. And also it's worth thinking about and bearing in mind that much of Du Bois' career, and this book as well, is a little earlier than a lot of the other people that we're thinking about in that trajectory, which then emerged in the 40s and into the 50s, right? So he's really on the early end of a lot of this. What else?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the political cartoon that's on the screen, where it comes from, and I mean, I guess we can all read it for ourselves, but I'm like, I can't take my eyes off it. Maybe just because it's big, but it's also pretty compelling.
It's really devastating
as well.
Right? Yeah. And some of these slides, I'm just really pulling images that resonate, images that speak to what Du Bois is trying to say. And this one really speaks to the defeat of Reconstruction, right? Again, many of you may know this history. Again, I've already hinted at the fact that Du Bois' last main chapter is called Back Towards Slavery, right? It's part of the arc of the story he's trying to tell. And if you can't read it here, it says worse than slavery here. And it's the Klan hand in hand with the White League. These are white paramilitary organizations, right? Who will play a crucial role in destroying Reconstruction and pushing back on the right to vote. And this gets to really central questions that, again, I'll return to them. I don't want to sort of give too many spoilers, but a big piece of what Du Bois is trying to ask is, what are the material prerequisites for equality? I already mentioned land, right? Without land, there can be no real equality under capitalism. Without land, you have to sell your labor under whatever conditions are being set by the capitalist system. But another important piece is the fact that without some force to uphold rights, the right to vote, for example, those votes can be pushed back through violence, which is what happened, right? And it sounds very obvious, but we don't register it very often still today, which is to say, we think that if we write down rights, that they're written into the law, or they're written into the Constitution, that makes them real. And if the history of white supremacy and the resilience of white supremacy in this country teaches us anything, it should be that rights require force to be upheld, right? Brown versus Board of Education, very famous Supreme Court school desegregation, decision, 1954. 10 years later, there was no desegregation on the basis of that. In other words, 10 years after which that was the law of the land, after which those rights, existed. The right to vote under Reconstruction was very precarious. For Du Bois, it was upheld by a dictatorship. That dictatorship was upheld by the power of Northern capitalists in the Union Army. And once that dictatorship was withdrawn, it was just violence against violence. And absent institutions for self-defense, militias, other kinds of armed organizations among the Black community, armed white groups were able to obliterate those rights. So that's really what this is speaking to, the complicity of white terrorist paramilitary organizations. I'm not sure which newspaper it's from, but I can check. Yeah. What else?
So another question we have is kind of asking you to go into a quote on page 723. At the top of page 723, and it reads, quote, "We have been cajoling and flattening the South and slurring the North because the South is determined to rewrite the history of slavery, and the North is not interested in history but in wealth." And this person wants you to specifically speak to the relationship between history and capital accumulation, if there is one that Du Bois is either pointing to or missing.
The relationship between history and capital accumulation? Yeah, no, it's massive, right? Again, there's going to be moments where Du Bois, many moments in this book where he summarizes the whole of that history. He summarizes the dynamics and the powers and the forces at play. But by and large, and just to connect it to that last question, by and large, the dictatorship that upholds abolition and the Reconstruction period, the determining force behind the presence of Northern Union armies in the South, right, occupying militarily the South. The deciders, the decision makers are capitalists, right, in the North. It's ultimately capitalists who decided to deploy the military to the South, and it's ultimately the capitalists who decided they'd had enough of Reconstruction, and they decided that they wanted to withdraw those forces, right? So the question of capitalism is crucial. And it gets deeper. And in the chapters we read for next week, you'll see the fact that he's trying to lay out and map a constellation of classes under a certain form of capitalism that exists in the US at that moment, in which industry is developing in the North, in which something closer to feudalism exists in the South, but in which that feudalism and that slavery are part of global capital, right? They're all integrated together in a powerful way. That doesn't mean that there's no tension and competition. There's a sharp competition between the North and the South, precisely about who is going to have and okay. I think it's working now. Maybe it's turned off. Does it appear to be working? Yes. Is this mic working? Cool. If that cut out, it's, I don't know, I guess I don't need to summarize it all. But yeah, no, capitalism is central to this story, and we'll see it play out through the dynamics of the way the chapters play out. Yeah.
brutality that is for like 20 years ago. It's like, boy.
No, for sure. And the way that he navigates the shame piece is very interesting, right? It's definitely, you know, and we know, again, we know this very well from the present, right? Which is to say, the South may be incredibly racist still right up to the present, but that does not, in any way um, reduce the complicity of Northern liberalism with white supremacy, right? The ongoing complicity, the way that it continuously benefits from what's happening in the South, the fact that it's really just a degree of difference from the South. And so you see the shame play out in different ways, right? One is this so-called, or this sort of quasi-Black legend, whereby Black legend is the phrase of sort of demonizing, these people over there, right? Of demonizing the South to excuse and justify the actions of the North. Right? And again, when Du Bois retells this story, what he's telling you is that the North is a key player in this, right? That it's fighting for, not to abolish slavery. The orientation of the North from the very beginning was to maintain the centrality of slavery within a capitalist system that the North benefited from. That was the goal. And again, spoiler alert, but Lincoln did not free the slaves and also didn't want to, right? He said, if I could save the Union with slavery, I would. If I could save the Union without slavery, I would. That was his goal. And it was a goal that very much represented, in many ways, the orientation of Northern capitalists. So, we've got, this complicity of the North, the complicity of liberalism, the complicity of capitalism in all of this. And if anything, more than complicity, because capitalists in the North are actually in the driver's seat of that system in a way that Southern sort of feudal landholders are not, right? The class that the North ultimately oversees the destruction of during the course of, of the war. Yeah. Oh, we don't have a mic. We can pass this one around if we want, or I can repeat the question. It doesn't matter. Yeah. Sure, that's fine. Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it really wasn't distributed much at all. As I said, it was very expensive. It was large. It was a lot of paper to print. In the context of the Great Depression, this was a huge book to buy. The cover price made it kind of prohibitively expensive. The print run was small as a result, and so it didn't have a huge impact on a mainstream level. It didn't even get that many reviews in sort of mainstream outlets, although it did get a couple. It did get some negative reviews from academics who said it was angry and partisan, right? So you've got it intervening in this debate, but hindered from the very beginning by it's always striking and funny to me the way that just very basic material phenomena dictate, the degree to which a book is read or not, right? It's expensive, the depression is happening. That had a huge impact on its readership for sure. But as with many other books, and I actually wrote this thing on Latin America, Du Bois's relevance to Latin America and reception in Latin America. And part of that is that, this was never translated. It's actually being translated now for distribution in Argentina for the first time ever. But part of why it was never translated is because it's very expensive to translate a book that's this long, right? But, Du Bois ends up having an influence through different, channels, right? Articles, visits, and other things. It's not necessarily through this book. But what happens with books like this is that they have waves of relevance, right? Where in the civil rights struggle, during the civil rights struggle, people start to read Black Reconstruction again, right? In certain periods, people start to read books that speak to the relevance of these questions in the present. And this is exactly what's happening, is that it was already happening before 2020, but after 2020, the relevance of this book, increased tenfold after 2016, right? Because one of the main questions that that this book seeks to provide an answer to is the relationship between the so-called white working class and broader liberation struggles, right? So the election of Trump poses this question in a different way that people are looking for answers to. All of this leads to Black Reconstruction being read and reread again in the present. And so it's much more, determined by these kinds of factors. Again, you could look back and I'm sure you would find that the release of this paperback edition played a big role in allowing it to be kind of available as well. So I think we've got time for a couple more questions if people have them or someone on the stream.
Do you think or know that Du Bois would rather be known as a sociologist or historian?
I think neither. Honestly, that's just me. I mean, he's so for people that aren't aware, Du Bois is not he's a genius in many ways. He's a pioneering, intellectual, but I don't even mean just like a pioneering black intellectual, right? He invented sociology essentially, and he did it here, right? When he wrote the Philadelphia Negro, which was published, I believe, in 1899. This is decades prior to what's understood as the invention of sociology, right? And yet he's doing it, and he's doing it in a systematic way, absolutely, pioneering, and doesn't get recognition for that, although that's changed a little bit more recently. Um, uh, I don't think he necessarily wanted to be a historian either. I think he sees in the writing of this book that he has to become a historian. He has to make that claim, as we talked about, for objectivity against propaganda, because he's trying to confront a very specific form of propaganda. What that leaves for him to be, I think, is very up in the air. And I think it's up for you all to sort of figure out and decide as well. But, I think he was a militant, right? And he really, really was. Again, he wasn't in 1899. But he developed into a militant who was an organizer, who was a writer, but a writer for popular audiences, who wrote to movements, who wrote to develop and deepen political solidarities, in a Pan-African internationalist way, right? This is the work that he was dedicating himself to, but he never really gave up on the idea of knowledge, for sure, right? He was developing a project, known as the sort of Encyclopedia Africana, which was going to be like a many volumes, dozens of volumes on, Black people across the globe, right? Latin America, Africa, within the US, in Europe. And that was a project that he dedicated himself to right to the end of his life. So he's still working on this knowledge piece, but he's also building, he's also working hand in hand with liberation movements and leaders across the African continent to build Pan-African unity, right? So he's doing all of these things at once. I don't think that makes him any one thing in particular, but I think sociologist and historian are maybe like two of the phrases that maybe that would least, describe that broad aspiration. That's just me, maybe.
The section where you talked about how to read the book, because there's one section on 726 where I was like, that's so interesting. How did you know that? Where he says, it's the last paragraph. For those 7 mystic years between Johnson's spin around the circle and the panic of 1873, a majority of thinking Americans in the North believed in the equal manhood of black folk. Like, how does he know that? And
how does he know and measure it? Yeah.
Like that? Like, he cites, there are endnotes to each chapter, but like, I'm like, where is that information coming from?
Yeah. For those that, just to repeat it, the question is about the bottom of 726, where he says, for those 7 mystic years between Johnson's swing around the circle and the panic of 1873, a majority of thinking Americans in the North believed in the equal manhood of black folk. Yeah. I mean, clearly there's something impressionistic happening, but it's a really good question, right? There's not an overarching, although we do have these today, right? Like overarching surveys, right? Opinion surveys, right? We see things, we see very important things. Like we see that, for example, in the weeks after the Minneapolis rebellions, the percentage of white Americans who believed that, police violence and abuse was a systemic problem rose by like 20 percentage points, a massive increase, right? And they've done those polls since the 60s, right? He didn't have those, right? So he couldn't poll white opinion in that way, but he is pointing toward it. And you'll see the way that this becomes part of the way the story is told is that he is summarizing what is manifested politically, right? Which is to say that there was a general will to uphold and support Reconstruction that was grounded in transformations about white belief about whether or not Black Americans were human, were equal, right? He marks, and it's pretty convincing, right? He marks a dramatic transformation of this during the Civil War. But again, it's like it's never going to be fully measured. But right, he sees the way that it manifests in terms of political will, in terms of legislation, in terms of the degree to which the system itself is transforming and ceding power to this kind of angle. The mechanisms of it are going to be things that we pay close attention to, right? He says at a certain point, it's very interesting. He says, this tragic though it may be, it was when Black Americans picked up guns and killed white men in the Civil War that others saw them as equal, right? And again, like there's something real there, right? Again, it's something about Minneapolis and people standing up for their rights and struggling and fighting and risking their lives that makes many white people who don't live anywhere near there think, you know what, maybe this is an important cause, right? You know what, maybe what people are saying about police brutality is true and we should take it seriously. So he's trying to sort of, without access to those numbers, right, make general statements about broad shifts that are happening. Sure. It's a great question, though. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Mhm. 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 It's a great question. So the question for those who couldn't hear it is about science and objectivity, and to what degree he believes in an objective reality in the world, and to what degree he doesn't. I'm not sure. And again, this is part of why I raise the questions around propaganda, science, history. And I think, again, we navigate these all the time, right? He believes that Black human beings are the same as all other human beings. And I don't think there's any, he sees that as a scientific fact, right? He sees race as a mythical construct. I think many of us agree with that. That seems to be an accurate statement about the actual reality we confront. That gets us part of the way, right? The other part of the way, though, is this question of to what degree and this is critical social science 101, right? To what degree our, um, you know, reality is shaped by assumptions, frameworks that maybe we're less aware of, right? That limit the way we can understand things, that limit the method of science, for example, right? Which is to say that the objectively perceptible and understood science of any century shifts and transforms, in accord with different kind of pieces. And on top of that is the prophetic piece, right? Which is that we don't exist just here in this moment. We exist as beings who are sort of projecting toward a future, who are struggling, who are fighting, who are operating according to non-quantifiable questions like, again, dignity, freedom, equality, and what those mean, right? So he's trying to navigate, I think, all of those, right? Again, there are pieces where he does sociology, he does history. He's an incredibly effective scholar, right? That makes him look at objective reality in a certain kind of way, right? Marxism has its own understanding of what objective reality looks like, which makes him look at economic dynamics, forces, interests, statistics in a certain kind of way. All of those, I think, play a role, right? And I think there's moments in the text where he feels like he's very, very objectivist, right? In a way that might be a little too much for us, that the reality is too hard or too self-revealing or self-given. But then he goes back to his prophetic mode, and he's just like, acting as if a sort of metaphor from Greek myth can best describe what's happening in the present, right? So he's definitely shifting between these. And again, that means different things, right? Are you trying to document for future generations, or are you trying to motivate people to act? Right? These are, again, we see this in Marx, we see this in other, incredibly important thinkers who are doing both of these things at once as well. Yeah. Cool.
It says in the first sentence, to the reader, what do you think the Bois use the word fascinating? What are the types of things that the Bois found out?
So the question is, into the reader, the first line says, a fascinating story. The story of transplanting millions of Africans to the New World in their bondage is a fascinating one. That's a good question. And I was the one, I think, who said that like these very like condensed bits of his text are very, like he's thought about every single word and the way that he uses them. And so the fact that he's choosing fascinating, I think, is a interesting one. And then he begins the next sentence, on top of that, with particularly interesting for students of human culture is the sudden freeing of Black folk, right? So their bondage is fascinating. Their freeing is particularly interesting. He's like operating in a vein of sort of, again, speaking to a student of the world, as he puts it, speaking to a student of human culture, but speaking in a way that's maybe coy, I don't know. This is just me sort of like, yeah, it's peculiar. It's definitely peculiar, right? Yeah. It's interesting, it's fascinating, it's brutal, it's demonic, right? Like it's all the it's a living hell, as he puts it. And so it is very, fascinating to look at him describe, such a history as fascinating. Um, Maybe he knows these are the first words that people are going to look at. Maybe he knows that he's speaking to a broader audience, but then again, he condenses that audience or cuts it in half later in the text, right? There's a general and universal scope to what he's trying to say, which is to say everyone needs to be concerned with this story. Everyone should think about and learn from this history. Again, writ large, that's what racial capitalism means, right? As he puts it, the transportation of 10 million people into slavery is not a side story of human history, right? It's at the very heart of that history. It's at the very heart of how we understand and define things like freedom and equality. The fact that we define them in terms of more abstract terms, less economic terms. The fact that we understand freedom and equality, for example, in the US in 1776 is a metaphor that allows people to actually keep people in chains while they're proclaiming freedom and equality for themselves, right? All of these things, I think, speak to what Du Bois is saying, is that this is at the heart of all of those conceptions, and that we really need to sort of recenter them. Recentering them is not simply, again, recentering the role and the centrality of slavery within a broader global capitalist system is not simply for inclusion. It's because it transforms the way we understand those institutions, the way we see them operating historically, and it transforms very, importantly, who and how we understand liberation as coming ultimately. So thank you all so much. Thanks to everyone on the stream. We really appreciate you all being here. We appreciate everyone who tuned in, who put their questions into the chat. Again, we really appreciate you all being part of an experimental mode for us. This is not normally how we, how we have the room set up. It's not normally how we have these conversations, but we're trying something out, and we really appreciate you all being a part of it. So thank you all. Super excited to see you all next week. And we'll be talking for next week about chapter 1 and chapter 2, the black worker and the white worker. Again, questions to bear in mind are, why is he calling both of these categories worker, first of all? If he's calling them worker, why does he have them in separate chapters? What does it mean to hold them together as worker, to hold them apart as black and white? And why is Du Bois doing these things? What is he doing by doing those things, right? These are the main questions we're going to be talking about. So again, thank you all, and we'll see you next week.